He tilts his head, almost gently, the way a curious child might, and offers her the same 3 words he has already given a dozen mothers before her. Go to sleep. Jeffrey Woods, before any of this, was almost aggressively ordinary, the sort of 13-year-old whose worst crime was indecision, baseball or soccer. That was the extent of his moral universe. He nursed a hopeless crush on a girl 2 grades above him and never found the courage to speak to her. Remember this version of him. He will not survive the next 20 minutes of his own story. His family arrived in a neighborhood that introduced itself with fruit baskets and repaired sidewalks, the kind of place built to convince a person that nothing bad could happen inside its borders. His mother believed it. Jeff cared little either way. The only thing that mattered to him in that new house was his younger brother, Liu, and even that devotion would be tested before the week was out. The test arrived at a bus stop, courtesy of 3 older boys with a knife held low enough to escape a driver's notice. They wanted Liu's money. Jeff offered them something else entirely. By the time the encounter ended, one of the 3 lay bleeding badly enough on the pavement that an ambulance arrived before the police did, which tells you a great deal about the order of priorities in that particular neighborhood. Justice, as it so often does in these stories, aimed itself at the wrong brother. Liu confessed to holding the knife before anyone thought to ask Jeff a single question, and off he went to a juvenile facility for a crime he did not commit, protecting the boy who had protected him minutes earlier. Jeff retreated into a silence so complete that his own parents stopped expecting an answer at the dinner table. Within a few weeks, he had stopped answering anyone at all. His only remaining tether to the world was Liu himself, sitting across a plastic visiting room table, saying almost nothing, because being in the same room as his brother was the only thing keeping either of them upright. His mother dragged him to a neighbor's birthday party, that most dreaded of suburban rituals, balloons on a mailbox, and parents discussing property values over a grill. Jeff wanted no part of it, and made certain everyone around him understood as much. None of them understood that the 3 boys from the bus stop had learned which house that party belonged to, and had not forgiven the boy who put one of their own in a hospital bed. They arrived through the backyard, carrying considerably more than grudges this time. A shouting match in front of a dozen party guests became, in the space of a few violent seconds, a fight for Jeff's life against 3 armed assailants. He survived. They did not. In the chaos of adults trying to break up the melee, someone reached for whatever was nearest, and what was nearest turned out to be a bottle of rubbing alcohol and a jug of bleach, both of which found their way onto Jeff before a dropped cigarette completed the transformation nobody at that party had signed up to witness. Weeks in a burn unit preceded his first glimpse of a mirror. The reflection answered the nurse's evident reluctance to let him near one. His skin had bleached into something that no longer resembled skin. The muscle damage around his mouth had carved his lips into a permanent, involuntary smile, the kind that has since become rather famous online. He took a knife to it himself afterward, cut the smile deeper into his own face, removed his own eyelids so blinking would never interrupt his vigilance again, and abandoned sleep altogether. That hospital room, more than the fire itself, is where the story most people know begins. His mother was granted the dubious privilege of being first through the door once the bandages came away, and the nurses on that hallway still describe the length of the silence that followed. Jeff did not cry. He asked nothing about why this had happened, or what a boy does with a face that will never again resemble his own. He laughed instead, a short laugh at nothing in particular, aimed at no one, and something in that small sound told his mother the boy she had raised was no longer entirely present in the room with her. 8 months later, and 2 towns distant, a family of 4 retired for an unremarkable Tuesday night. He tilts his head, almost gently, the way a curious child might, and offers her the same 3 words he has already given a dozen mothers before her. Go to sleep. Only 3 of them survived to scream about it. That scene, and the dozens like it that followed across the years, is the Jeff most audiences already know. You already watched him do it in the opening moments of this very video. His own family received no exemption from that ritual either, though whether that final visit constituted love with nowhere left to go, or the complete absence of anything resembling love, remains a question nobody has answered with confidence. One thing can be said for certain. Jeff was not the only young mind in that part of the country to break in precisely this fashion, around precisely this time. The others found different doorways to stand in. Jeff, at least, wanted you to notice him. The next name on tonight's list never cared whether you noticed anything at all, right up until you woke up short 1 kidney. Mitch lost the house before he lost anything else. 9 years of loyalty to a plant, repaid with a 2-week notice and no severance worth mentioning. 4 months of fruitless applications later, the bank stopped sending warnings and started sending a date. By the time the foreclosure completed itself, he had exhausted his capacity for anger and settled into something closer to gratitude, mainly directed at his brother Edwin, who answered the phone on the first ring. The arrangement was meant to be temporary, 2 duffel bags and a spare room at the edge of town. It stopped being temporary after 1 week. He woke on the 7th morning with a gash across his cheek and no memory of acquiring it, an inconvenience he attributed to a rough night against a nightstand. He also woke more tired than he had been when he went to bed, regardless of how many hours the clock insisted he had slept, and some mornings a faint copper smell lingered on his pillowcase that he preferred not to investigate too closely. A third development, rather more difficult to explain away, convinced him something was wrong. A dull ache low on his side sent him to the hospital, where a doctor delivered her findings without ceremony. His left kidney was missing, not injured, removed with a precision that spoke of considerable surgical skill, cleanly enough to leave no mark beyond the incision itself, and performed without waking him even once. Edwin preferred to believe it was a clerical error at a hospital rather than an actual missing organ, and Mitch, understandably, wanted to believe the same. He installed a chain lock on his bedroom door regardless, the 20-minute kind requiring nothing more than a screwdriver from a kitchen drawer, and told himself it was for peace of mind. The lock performed about as well as any such device performs against a visitor with no particular interest in using the door. Sleep did not come easily after that, which turned out to be the only reason he was awake at all a few nights later. At almost midnight, when he opened his eyes to find something standing beside his bed. It possessed no eyes of its own, only two dark, hollowed sockets where they belonged, and a mouth left hanging open as though still weighing whether Mitch was worth the effort of finishing. His hand found the camera on the nightstand before his conscious mind had registered the danger, and he managed a single photograph before the thing lunged. Claws opened his chest with enough force to empty his lungs, and whatever survival instinct took command after that carried him out of bed, through the door, and into the tree line before he understood he was even moving. He did not get far. A root, or perhaps a stone, he never determined which, sent him face first into the dirt, and the last sound he registered was something moving through the brush behind him before consciousness abandoned him entirely. A jogger discovered him at first light, curled against a fallen tree a quarter-mile from the house, and the paramedics required some patience before extracting a coherent account. Given that the account Mitch kept attempting to give did not resemble anything a sane person says to strangers holding a stretcher. He woke in a hospital bed for the second time that month, alive, bearing claw marks the doctors could not adequately explain. Nor could anyone explain the second piece of news awaiting him, that Edwin, the brother who had taken him in without a single question, had been discovered dead in that same house on that same night. The thing that visited Mitch has never been identified, its origins never traced, its appetite for kidneys never satisfactorily explained. It has granted no interviews, it has left no confession. It has only the name the internet eventually settled on, for reasons that require no further elaboration. In the years since, reports describing an identical hollow-eyed shape have surfaced across a dozen states, always after dark, always near someone who wakes a day or two later, missing considerably more than they remember losing. A handful of those reports include photographs, grainy and imperfect, captured in the same half-second of panic Mitch once managed. Investigators comparing the images agree the wounds resemble no known animal, and the surgical precision resembles nothing a random attacker could achieve without training. Nobody in an official capacity has ever said what conclusion that invites. They have not needed to. That particular predator answers to no one, which very nearly qualifies him as the merciful option. The next boy answers to something with considerably more patience and a taste for recruiting the already broken. Some portions of what follows Toby remembers directly. Others he has been told so many times that memory and hearsay have become indistinguishable, and he stopped attempting to separate them long ago. Before any of this acquired a diagnosis, he was a boy who enjoyed dismantling broken electronics to understand their workings, never quite managing to reassemble them correctly. His sister Lyra covered for him whenever their father discovered the pieces scattered across the garage floor, sweeping the evidence into a shoebox before it could become a problem. She was 7 years his senior, old enough to have effectively raised him during the long stretches their father proved unfit for the task, and young enough that she never once treated him as a burden rather than a brother. Being a child proved difficult for Toby well before anything supernatural entered his life. Tourette syndrome supplied tics beyond his control, and a stutter that worsened whenever nerves took hold, which around other 10-year-olds constituted most of the time. His classmates discovered that imitating him produced a satisfying reaction. Teachers proved little help in discouraging the practice. By the time he understood the full extent of his own outsider status, his parents had already withdrawn him from public school for good. One incident in particular endures among the handful of former classmates who still discuss him. A substitute teacher, unaware of the arrangement, forced Toby to read aloud before the class and laughed along when his stutter caught on every third word. He said nothing in response. He closed the book, returned to his seat, and did not speak in that classroom again for the remainder of the year. Homeschooling offered a measure of relief. His mother approached his lessons with more patience than any teacher had managed, and Lyra ensured he never felt like an inconvenience for the way his mind worked. His father represented the opposite of both women, a man who regarded his son's tics as something to be beaten out of him rather than understood, a philosophy he articulated with his fists more nights than anyone in that house cared to count. His father possessed a distinctive manner of addressing the tics, a particular weight to his footsteps in the hallway that signaled Toby had twitched or stuttered once too often in front of a wrong company. Lyra positioned herself between them with such regularity that it hardened into an unspoken routine, not unlike the routine some families maintain for setting a dinner table. Lyra held the entire arrangement together, and she died in a car accident before Toby turned 16. Whatever remained of his capacity to cope departed with her. His father offered nothing resembling comfort in the weeks that followed her funeral. If anything, the beatings intensified, as though grief itself had become one more provocation. Something inside him gave way entirely on a night nobody who knew him has managed to explain, even now. His father did not survive it. Neither did most of the block where Toby had grown up, and whether the fire began deliberately or escaped his control once ignited remains a detail never satisfactorily settled. The neighbors who gave statements afterward agreed on one point. Nobody recalled hearing him make a single sound throughout the entire ordeal, neither during nor after, a silence several of them found more disturbing than screaming would have been. By the time anyone beyond that neighborhood understood what had occurred, Toby had already vanished, walking away from the only home he had ever known, while it burned at his back. He did not get far before something located him first. The precise mechanics of the encounter remain disputed, but every account agrees on the essential detail: a tall, faceless figure that neither spoke nor gave chase, requiring neither to accomplish its purpose. Toby went with it regardless. Whether that constituted a choice or the final decision he ever exercised any genuine control over resists easy classification, given that not long afterward he lost the ability to recall most of what preceded that night. Fragments surface occasionally. Lyra's face, the sound of the fire, his father's voice. Never enough to reconstruct the complete picture. Contemporary accounts tend to agree on several particulars: a gas mask he refuses to remove in public, a modified hatchet rarely absent from his hand, and a habit of laughing at moments that call for nothing of the sort, a residual tic from a mind that never reassembled itself after that first night among the trees. Whether the laugh remains involuntary or has become something he has learned to savor is not a question anyone who ventured close enough to ask has survived to answer with confidence. The Rogers house was demolished years ago, though the lot itself has never been redeveloped, and locals attribute this less to construction costs than to a general reluctance to be the one who breaks ground upon it. As for Toby, he has since been placed at the scene of enough small-town disappearances that certain investigators have begun treating the mask and hatchet as a genuine pattern rather than a story teenagers exchange to frighten one another. He does not hide particularly well. He is rarely the one found first.